Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this stunning theme music, and we stop it really quick because we don't want to be sued by the ghost of Jay Ward, you know that this is one of the special theme shows here at the bathtub. We're post-tech, but that doesn't mean we can't reel out that old 8-track tape of Peabody and Sherman and signal the arrival of one of our more exciting theme shows here at the bathtub, which is the Pointless Adventures in Literature. We call it Pointless Adventures in Literature. We don't have the whiteboard. I used to carry the whiteboard all the way up here so I could write those words so everyone knew what I was saying because I'm so inarticulate. But it's called Pointless Adventures in Literature. Now, normally I witter on pointlessly about books that I've been reading in the bathtub, but sometimes I witter on pointlessly about my personal experiences and adventures in literature, and they're just as pointless. But I thought today we'd talk about an old friend of mine. I've been meaning to do one for a long time. My old friend, Gustav Hasford. Gustav Hasford. Gus, as we used to call him. There's a picture. There's a picture that Charlene took of him when I think we were three of us were at Jack London House when she took that picture, I think. And would have been 1976 or something crazy like that. And so we're going to talk about Gus, and the most important thing is I forgot the patter for this one, which is these are pointless adventures. That means there's sometimes they're pointless, sometimes they're meaningless, sometimes they're both pointless and meaningless, but they're always pointless, meaningless, or both, and we always bank on that at the bathtub because we always try to keep our word about everything we do here. So we're going to tell a little pointless story. This is Gus's first novel called The Short Timers, and almost nobody is going to know what the hell that is. It's a very hard book to find. It's extremely rare now, but you will know it if you know it was turned into the Full Metal Jacket. Full Metal Jacket. It was based on Gus's book, and Gus really wrote the script, and frankly the whole script is clearly Gus. It's nothing but his book and Gus. And one of the things I found fascinating about my long friendship with Gus was that this is considered one of the most popular movies. I think if you talk to young people particularly, this is like one of the top 10 favorite movies of people under 30 or something. And it's easily my least favorite Kubrick movie. And I don't really like it as much as the book. But it's just interesting. It's a very famous book of Gus's, a famous movie based on Gus's book. And I knew Gus pretty well when he was working with Kubrick in London. There's so many. I have so many stories. Whenever I think of my old friend Gus, I sometimes think of it as my difficult old friend Gus, is I think of those Reader's Digest used to have these little short comic essays called "The Most Unforgettable Character I Ever Knew." I would definitely say Gus is probably the most unforgettable person I've ever known in my life. You can't think of Gus without thinking, and I know that lots of people have known and loved and hated Gus out there who will probably hear this, but he is totally unforgettable. You can never forget him. The first time I met Gus, I was 16, and he came. I was at a writing workshop for the summer up in yes, Dodo, we hear you, up in Seattle, which was a great summer. I really loved Seattle, and I still love Seattle because of the many things up there. And Gus showed up the last week or two, and he just literally showed up with his wife at the time. And as soon as he came in, he was just never stopped talking. He was always making ridiculous jokes. He was this big, kind of overweight guy with a kind of like you saw that picture, kind of balding, bullet-headed, really short, still had this GI cut, big glasses he was taking on and off, wearing this big army, some big army jacket or something. And he was really loud and really funny and really gregarious and was friendly to everybody, always got to know everybody. And I started hanging out with Gus up there that summer. And, he was hilarious. I don't know what it was about Gus, but he was one of the most funny people I've ever met, particularly when he was younger. And I don't know what Gus was. He was in his 20s then. And one of the things I think about with Gus was when I talk to people who want to be writers and they think about their desires to write and so forth, and they give up very quickly. Gus, when I first met Gus, he had just got out of Vietnam, maybe a year or two before that. And he had gone to Vietnam, according to him, simply so he could write a novel about it. That was it. Gus had wanted to be a writer like me since he was like 14 or 15. And his history, most of which I only know through my vague recollections of him telling it to me, was that I'm trying to remember his real name was Gerald Soloff. I have it in here somewhere. I don't know. I think Jerry. His real name was Jerry, I think. No, it wasn't Soloff. I'm thinking of somebody else. Jerry somebody. I should look that up. And he changed his name to Hasford later, because he thought it would be a Gustav Hasford. He didn't look like Gustav. He was like some Alabama kid. He was a dirt poor Alabama kid, I think. I'm going to look this up now just because I think this is kind of interesting. I forget his real name, except I know it was Jerry Hasford. There's not many Gustavs in Wikipedia. So his first name was Jerry Hasford. And it says there Gustav was his middle name. I thought he told me he made that up, but I don't remember. So he started off as a 14, 15-year-old kid, kind of like myself, nurtured come from a really poor family. I was not a poor family, but we both grew up going to the library and getting books out of the library. Gus's adventures in libraries became a kind of probably the most notorious thing about him after a while. I'll get to that later. But what I wanted to start off by saying was that, writers who give up and they want to be writers and they say they write for a summer and then they finish. Gus wanted to write since he was a kid. And when I met him in 1971 probably, he was one of the worst writers I ever met. I really liked him, but he kept showing me his stuff. And we would pass stuff. He was always reading. He was a very good reader of other people, and I had to read his stuff. I hated his prose was just awful, and it was really kind of ridiculous stories, and they never quite worked. And they were kind of rip-offs of Donald Bartholomew, and there would be occasional sentences, but they were just really overly controlled. And he was writing a book then called The Tattooed Chicken. It was called The Tattooed Chicken. He showed me chapters of this thing. It was totally terrible. And it was about somebody getting out of Vietnam and traveling across country with a chicken. And there was Gus had a really weird sense of humor, just a crazy sense of humor. It had all that kind of, like a tattooed chicken was crazy. And he worked on that for the years I knew him. And it must have been, oh God, what was it? It was several years later. It seemed like decades that he was working on this book. 1979, this finally came out. So over 4 or 5 years after I met him, he continued working on that, and it turned into the Short Timers. So every time I'd see Gus, he would be working on these chapters would be metamorphosing into these stories that were eventually sewed together. This originally started off as a lot of stories, so he just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And then when he finished the book, the Short Timers, he tried to sell it. He spent 3 years sending it to every publisher he could find. And one of the things that all the publishers told him, and I actually sat in a room while Donald Wollheim told him this, was that no one wanted to read a Vietnam novel. This was in the early 70s, the mid-70s. And Gus Kess kept sending it out and sending it out. And eventually came up with an important editor who helped work with him on it. I want to say Ted Solitaroff, but I can't remember now. And they put this out with Harper and Row, and it came out in 1979. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a picture that we took at Wolf House when we went there once or twice to the Jack London house. We were both big fans of Jack London, and his partner at the time, Charlene, took that picture. I'm pretty sure, and yeah, there it is. And so anyway, it took forever and ever. It came out. It got good reviews. It was reviewed in places like Time. It did very well. It was pretty much one of the first Vietnam novels. Again, it's very hallucinatory. It's very surreal. It's very wild. There's lots of it merges with almost fantastic and fantasy events in some ways. And even the closing chapter, which is about this, you remember from the movie, the sniper who's just picking off this whole company, one guy after another, and drawing them out into this trap. In the book, it's almost like a demonic force in a way. But anyway, it's still worth trying to find and reading. But then, shortly after the book came out, maybe a year or two after that, I was living in Los Angeles, in a place where Theodore Sturgeon was my neighbor. J. Michael Reeves got us all in there, and then J. Michael went off somewhere else. And I got Gus into one of the units in this kind of weird writers. It was a really writers colony. We were all writers almost in that whole group in Vendome Street. It was real Bukowski territory. And Gus moved in there, and he started working with Kubrick and basically sitting up all night on telephone calls with Stanley Kubrick, which was quite a romantic thing to be happening in this rundown, beat up a series of bungalow apartments. It looked like a really rundown version of Mulholland Drive, the place the girls live in Mulholland Drive. Only this was much more beat up and run down. So anyway, that's how Gus worked on that. And then, I knew him for many years, and intensely in some ways, because it was very hard to know Gus without being kind of intensely part of his life, or him being part of yours. And he was often staying in my house and sleeping on the floor, and he could be very difficult, particularly as he got older. There was a lot of things to talk about with Gus. I'm going to talk about a little bit now, and I'll probably bleed this over into a part 2. But the part that Gus became most famous for was for stealing library books. This is this is the sort of dark side. There were a few dark sides to Gus, who was a bit crazy. And when I first knew Gus, we used to go to bookshops, secondhand bookshops in Seattle, and Gus would steal books, which was one thing he did. And then he would go to libraries, and he would go to libraries, and he had tons of these. He was obsessed. You think this is obsessive about books? Gus had thousands of books, and he kept them all in a storage shed here in San Luis Obispo. I eventually I told him a lot about San Luis, which I've always loved, and he moved here. Him and Charlene moved to Morro Bay in the early 80s, I want to say, late 70s, early 80s, and he opened up before he even moved here, I think, he rented a big storage unit out on Tank Farm Road. I helped him move all his books into it, and he just had thousands of books in boxes all over the world, pretty much. Many of them were stolen from libraries. So I remember walking with Gus. We would go to all the used bookshops. One thing about Gus was fascinating is he could never walk by a box. You know how you walk down the street and there's be a box of beat up books, and there's cat pee stains on them, and they're just covered with dust and everything. He never passed a box of books without picking one out. I never saw him ever do it. He would always go, I've always wanted, I'll take this one. He'd brush all the dog hairs off it, and then we'd take that. And everywhere we went, he would get a book. And then usually at the end, we used to go every day for lunch. Every day that I think I knew Gus, he went to McDonald's. He had McDonald's. He was like the guy in Super Size Me. And Gus did start to get supersized. He went there for lunch every single day and had the same thing, like a quarter pounder with cheese and a milkshake and chips and stuff. And at dinner, if there was one around, he would go to Sizzler. So whenever I'd go see Gus, those were our 2 meals. We go there, and then we go to Sizzler. He was an obsessive character, but he never stopped talking. He was always usually pretty funny. So then, but at the end of every kind of book haunting adventure where we go to bookstores, he would go to the Santa Monica Public Library, because he lived in Santa Monica at this time, but I accompanied him in many places. And he would say, I'm going to go to the library. Is there anything you want? and I always said, no, please don't get any books for me from the library. I don't want any books from the library. And anyway, he would go off, and I wouldn't see him again. But when he'd take these books from the library, he had this whole system where he would strip them down and he would cut them up. And this is the darkest side of Gus, but it's a big part of him. And he would cut them all down and make them, and he would like put sometimes I think, did he put like contact paper or something on? He would do something to make them look like sort of normal books. And Gus would complete this. He would, anytime he needed a book, he would get one. Well, it turned out that Gus didn't just steal from the Santa Monica Public Library, but he traveled all over the world, and eventually stole from many, many, many libraries, and especially when he went to England, and he would often go off to places like Australia for months and months at a time. He loved Australia, and he loved England and London, and he loved Greece. Where he spent a lot of time. Anyway, I'm going to stop this now. This is part 1. I'm going to go on to the second half. I think that's got to have whetted your appetite, the second half. I just don't want to turn these into too long episodes, and I'll run them in two things. It's just hard to start talking about Gus without covering all the bases. Okay, I'll carry on with this story in part 2. Stay safe, happy bathing. If you don't want to hear about a library thief, don't listen to part 2.